You weren't born disorganized. You were born dynamic. And that dynamism is not a flaw. It's a current, a deep-running, soul-bending current that refuses to be dammed. Because extroversion isn't noise. It's signal. It's not about talking too much. It's about feeling too deeply to remain silent. You don't crave attention. You crave expression. You don't escape routine out of laziness. You dismantle it because it numbs the fire you're meant to live from. They call you flaky because your soul couldn't play dead. They called you unstable because your truth evolves. They said you were inconsistent when really you were just becoming too many things for their static minds to process. You weren't meant for the repeat button. You were made for the remix. Nietzsche said, you must still have chaos in yourself to give birth to a dancing star. They forgot that chaos is divine. They forgot that some souls aren't here to walk in straight lines. They're here to draw constellations. But the world worships stillness when it comes from control. It praises silence when it comes from suppression. It honors endurance when it means self-betrayal. And that is not virtue. That is violence in a velvet glove. Jung warned us, that which we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. So what happens when a generation of extroverted souls are told that their nature is disorder? They dim, they dull, they disappear into roles. They learn to self-edit in real time, to nod instead of speak, to sit instead of move, to numb instead of feel, and the fire turns inward, now labeled anxiety, now called burnout, now medicated as a sickness that was never sickness, only suffocated soul. But here's the truth. You're not broken. You're not unstable. You're uncontained. You move because stagnation feels like death. You speak because silence feels like a coffin. You shift because every version of yourself deserves expression. And still they ask, why can't you just settle? Why can't you be more predictable? Why can't you commit? Because you were never designed to commit to confinement. You commit to truth, to evolution, to becoming the next shape your soul whispers toward. They confuse your exits with betrayal, but don't see the betrayal that comes from staying. You've tried. You've stayed longer than you should have. In jobs, in relationships, in homes, in roles. You've clenched your jaw through rituals of repetition, trying to fit into rhythms that starve your breath. And your nervous system screamed, not from fear, but from dishonor, from a deep ancestral knowing that stillness without truth is a graveyard. So you left. They called it impulsive, but you knew that was your survival. That was your sovereignty. That was your resurrection. Because you don't live in one direction. You live in explosions of alignment. This is why your joy is magnetic. This is why your presence changes rooms. Because you are presence, not posture. You don't entertain. You ignite. You don't socialize. You transmit. And when people try to confine you, they are not doing it out of malice. They're doing it out of misunderstanding. They're trying to keep your wildfire in a fireplace. But what they don't know is that you are the wilderness. Your mind doesn't work in bullet points. It dances. Your heart doesn't speak in whispers. It sings. Your body doesn't wait for permission. It moves. And this isn't a defect. This is design. So throw away their labels. Flaky? Number? You are fluid. Inconsistent? Never. You are evolving. Too much? You are finally enough for yourself. And when you no longer fear your own rhythm, they can no longer trap you with theirs. You don't belong inside a box. You break boxes just by breathing. So let the world misunderstand. Let them gossip. Let them label while they build cages for your wild. You build cathedrals for your truth. Unapologetically, uncontainably, unforgettably. You are not flaky. You are freedom in human form. You are freedom in human form, which is exactly why they fear you, because you do not bend to tradition. You do not worship repetition. You do not follow rituals that betray your core. You refuse to be predictable, not out of rebellion, but out of reverence. Reverence for the self still in motion. Reverence for the truth that doesn't calcify. Reverence for the sacred chaos that precedes every act of creation. They fear you not because you're loud, but because your movement reveals their paralysis. You show them what it looks like to change without apology, to evolve without a permission slip, to live without a leash. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who your parents approve of, not who your culture permits, not who your past predicts, who you are, beneath the shame, beneath the guilt, beneath the well-trained smile and socially acceptable script. You didn't come here to be easy to manage. You came here to awaken the myth, to remind the world that authenticity has many faces, and yours refuses to wear the same mask twice. So when they say you lack discipline, let them, because they confuse discipline with domestication. They don't understand that it takes immense discipline to honor your soul's unfolding when everything around you demands stillness, to choose truth over approval again and again and again. That's the real discipline. To know that you may be alone in rooms that praise self-betrayal as professionalism, but you still won't dilute your flame to blend in. You still won't wear stability. If it means suffocating your essence, you still won't settle, because you're not afraid to start over. You're afraid to de-slowly, in a version of life that was never yours. You move, not to escape, but to stay loyal to the living intelligence inside you that never stopped growing. And yes, that might mean careers change. Friendships end. Homes evolve. Priorities shift. Not because you're inconsistent, but because you refuse to fossilize in a structure that no longer fits your becoming. There's a word for this: integrity. You have it in your cells, in your laughter, in your departures. They called it flakiness, but it was your soul saying, "I cannot breathe here anymore." This is how it looks when someone remembers who they are faster than the world can label them. It looks like movement that makes others nervous. It looks like laughter that doesn't apologize. It looks like joy that doesn't seek permission. And yes, sometimes it looks like being misunderstood by everyone, except those who have dared to do the same. You don't need everyone to understand you. You only need you to stop abandoning yourself. Every time the room flinches, your power is not in being reliable to others. It's in being devoted to your truth, even when it's messy, even when it costs you comfort, even when it changes shape. That's not chaos. That's creation. That's consciousness in motion. That's divinity, refusing to be domesticated. You were not born to become the idea of mature. You were born to become the version of you that burns, lies on sight, that changes direction mid-sentence, because the wind whispered a deeper truth. That's not flighty. That's tuned in. You listen so well, they think you're unstable. But what's actually unstable is building a life on someone else's silence, on someone else's checklist, on someone else's wounds. And you know this, which is why you move. You move like wind wrapped in memory, like fire disguised as conversation, like a truth too alive to be tamed. You are not inconsistent. You are devoted to what is real, to what is present, to what is alive. And that changes everything. It changes everything. Because once you become loyal to what is alive in you, you can never go back to performing what is dead. You stop dressing up decay and calling it duty. You stop pretending your gut isn't screaming while your mouth says, "Yes, of course, I'll be there." You stop betraying the wildfire inside just to keep someone else's candle lit. And this terrifies them, not because you're wrong, but because your movement reminds them of their own stagnation. You don't hurt them, you mirror them. You reflect everything they've locked behind obligation, every instinct they've chained to calendars, every wild impulse they've labeled irresponsible. Because here's the deeper truth. The world isn't afraid of your inconsistency. It's afraid of your sovereignty. It's afraid of the soul that moves before it asks, of the voice that speaks before it edits, of the fire that acts before it gets approval. You are the terrifying thing that cannot be managed. You are the unpredictable force that shows up in full truth and refuses to wear yesterday's mask. Not because you're scattered, but because you're synced to something ancient, to something wild, to something free. Carl Jung called this process the emergence of the self, not the persona, not the mask, not the obedient reflection of society's needs, but the self, whole, undivided, uncompromised. That self isn't flaky. It just doesn't conform to dead systems. It doesn't breathe on cue. It doesn't fake laughter at shallow jokes. It doesn't show up to gatherings that drain its radiance. It doesn't answer texts when the soul needs silence. It doesn't apologize for moving on, even when the world begs it to stay predictable. Because this self knows. Flakiness is a term used by people who have chained themselves to things they hate, just to appear stable. And they project that hatred onto the ones who chose freedom instead. But you didn't choose chaos. You chose alignement. They call you unstable because they've only seen stability as martyrdom. But you are not a martyr. You are not an emotional contortionist. You are not a puppet for politeness. You are the soul that walks out of cages, even when the door is wide open. You are the one who doesn't just talk about truth. You move in truth. That's not inconsistency. That's integrity in motion. And the more you align, the less you tolerate anything that isn't fully alive. You become allergic to stale rooms, numb words, false smiles. You'd rather be alone with your becoming than in a crowd with your betrayal. And yes, you may lose people. You may lose gigs. You might lose comfort. But you won't lose yourself. And that is the only thing worth keeping. You'll stop making plans that feel like prisons. You'll stop agreeing to futures that don't honor your evolution. You'll stop dragging yourself through loops just to maintain an illusion of reliability. Because when you finally trust your own rhythm, you stop dancing for anyone else's silence. You don't owe anyone your predictability if it costs you your aliveness. You don't owe them your attendance if it costs you your presence. You don't owe them your false consistency if it costs you your soul. You owe you. You owe yourself the full expression of what is real now, not what made sense last year, not what kept them happy last month, not what your childhood conditioning still whispers is right, but what feels like truth in your lungs, in your spine, in your becoming. This is the power they can't wrap in a calendar. This is the freedom they can't schedule. This is the wildfire they'll always try to name flaky, because naming it makes it easier to ignore. But you're not here to be named. You're here to burn. And in that fire, you won't become consistent. You'll become uncontainable. You'll become uncontainable. And they will call it every name but sovereignty. They'll say you're lost, but you're actually arriving. They'll say you're unstable, but you've never been more rooted. They'll say you're avoiding responsibility, but you're carrying a responsibility so rare it terrifies them. The responsibility to remain loyal to your own becoming. This is the holy rebellion of extroverted souls. Not to speak over others, but to speak from fire. Not to be loud, to be heard, but because truth erupts when it's been buried too long. You don't seek the spotlight. You are the light. And light doesn't ask permission to shine. It just radiates. And those living in shadows mistake it for arrogance. But you're not here to be humble for their comfort. You're here to be whole. You're here to be real. You're here to remember who you were before they convinced you that your rhythm needed their regulation. So you don't conform to stillness. You don't bow to schedules that drain you. You don't measure your life in consistency. You measure it in alignment, one spark at a time, one room that lights you up, one conversation that cracks you open, one move that feels like home in motion. You are not a dropout from someone else's plan. You are a graduate of your own programming. You walked out of the school that taught you your instincts were unreliable. You tore up the curriculum that labeled your energy a liability. You dropped the mask that nodded while your soul screamed. This isn't irresponsibility. It's initiation into a life that breathes as deeply as you do, into a path that can't be tracked by Google Maps, into a truth that evolves faster than tradition can capture. Because this path, this wild, unstructured, sometimes messy, always alive path, isn't built by discipline imposed from the outside. It's carved by devotion, devotion to your essence, devotion to your voice, devotion to your holy inconsistency. You are not here to be solid stone. You are here to be sacred wind, moving where you are called, arriving where you are needed, leaving where your light can no longer live. And if they call it flaky, let them. They're mistaking freedom for fear, because fear is predictable. Fear is consistent. Fear stays in one place long after the soul has left. But not you. You move, like someone who finally realized that staying put for approval was the slowest kind of death. And the truth is, you're not afraid to start again. You've done it 100 times. Every time you left a version of yourself behind that was too small to contain your expansion. You've said goodbye to identities that felt like prisons dressed as names. You've left stage, cities, relationships, when they ask you to abandon your breath to stay, because you'd rather be misunderstood than live one more second as someone you're not. This is not instability. This is evolution without apology. So stop measuring yourself by their calendars. Stop labeling your magic with their metrics. Stop trying to prove that your movement is valid. It doesn't need to be validated. It is valid because it's yours. And that's what they don't get. You were never trying to be understood. You were trying to breathe. And now you do. Deeply, fully, without a script, without a plan, without their approval. You finally understand. Flakiness was never your crime. Trying to fit into their tiny definitions was, but no more. Now you move, with purpose, with fire, with truth. And if they can't name it, can't pin it down, can't wrap it in a box, good. That means you're finally free. That means you're finally free. Not the kind of freedom they market in slogans, not the sanitized, curated version dressed in consumerism, but the feral kind, the raw, blood on your teeth kind, the kind of freedom that burns bridges and blesses the ashes, the kind that doesn't need to be posted, explained, or branded, the kind that just is because you are. And that's the kind of freedom the world cannot contain. So they try to rename it. They try to reduce it. They try to control it by calling it unstable. They try to moralize your movement by dressing it in guilt. But let them try. You are no longer reachable through shame. You are no longer programmable through fear. You are no longer available for roles that mute your roar. You don't fear instability anymore, because you've seen how brittle falls stability really, Ireland. One tragedy, one betrayal, one quiet moment of truth, and the whole charade collapses. But you already collapsed. You already died to every version of yourself that was built for survival. You already walked through the inferno of rejection, misunderstanding, and exile, and came out the other side undomesticated. That's why you don't need consistency to feel safe. You don't need routine to feel real. You don't need predictability to feel powerful. You just need alignment. And when alignment moves, you move without apology, without justification, without begging for understanding. You are not here to explain your exits. You are here to embody your entrances, to enter every space as the truth they've been avoiding, to enter every conversation as the mirror they never asked for, to enter your life not as a role, but as the myth it was always meant to become. You don't care to be liked. You care to be lit. Lit from the inside with that rare fire that doesn't flicker when others doubt it. That fire that doesn't dim just because the room can't handle its heat. Because now you know your presence is not an accident. It's a confrontation with their stagnation, with their comfort, with their carefully curated versions of reality. You don't need to say a word. Your walk says everything. Your laughter breaks programming. Your gaze dismantles illusion. Your sudden departure becomes a spiritual event. Because you don't leave places the way most people do. You don't disappear out of immaturity. You ascend out of integrity. You move because your truth does. You shift because your soul evolves. You vanish from dynamics that insult your depth. You leave not because you're scattered, but because you're complete. And they hate that. They hate that you don't need to cling to something to prove your worth. They hate that you don't need to struggle to be legitimate. They hate that you can disappear and still carry your power with you. They wanted you confused. They wanted you reliant. They wanted your validation to depend on their perception. But you broke that cycle. You chose clarity over comfort. You chose soul over structure. You chose truth over tradition. And now you breathe like someone who's done apologizing. You show up because you want to, not because you're afraid not to. You stay when the space feels sacred. Not because someone guilted you into silence. You commit when your whole being says yes, not because you were conditioned to self-sacrifice. And this is what they never taught you, that devotion without self-abandonment is the highest form of integrity. You can be loyal without losing yourself. You can be committed without freezing in place. You can be grounded without being trapped. You're not here to prove your stability to people who lost their own. You're here to remember that motion is sacred, that presence doesn't mean permanence, that authenticity doesn't always come with a schedule. So move when your soul says move. Speak when your fire says speak. Rest when your being says rest. Leave when your truth has outgrown the room. You are not flaky. You are faithful to the wild, holy, untamable rhythm that makes you real. You are faithful to your fire, and that fire answers to no one, not to their timelines, not to their expectations, not to their maps of what a functional life should look like, because you didn't come here to function. You came here to ignite. They'll tell you a life without structure is a life without value, but you know better now. You know structure without soul is just a prettier prison, a routine that numbs you, a calendar that chokes you, a perfectly packaged day with no pulse. And you were never meant to trade your breath for belonging. That's why your energy pulses like it does. That's why you light up in new places, around new people, in conversations where ideas are alive, not embalmed in politeness. That's why you feel dead when everything stays the same. Because sameness is not safety to you. It's suffocation. You were born with a compass that doesn't point north. It points inward. And when you follow it, you're not chasing dopamine. You're tracking destiny. Not destiny in the sanitized, goal board kind of way, but the kind of destiny that rearranges your molecules. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. The kind that burns your bridges for you so you have no choice but to fly. And every time you trusted that in a nudge, every time you said yes to change, to leaving, to starting over. You didn't fall apart. You came alive. So let them talk. Let them call you reckless. Let them call you hard to pin down. Let them say you're inconsistent. They only say that because they've mistaken captivity for character. They measure maturity by how long someone can stay in a box. You measure it by how often you question the box itself. They want your history to be a straight line, but your soul writes in spirals, in storms, in sudden leaps and sacred silence. You're not building a resume. You're building a myth, one forged in instinct, one sculpted by choice, one unfolding in real time, no template, no script, no apology. And your myth doesn't follow a 5-year plan. It follows alchemy. Sometimes that alchemy looks like chaos, like walking away from something that looks perfect on paper, like choosing solitude over surface-level connection, like quitting halfway through something because your spirit already outgrew it. That's not weakness. That's deep alignment. And it's rare. And it's threatening. Because it can't be bought. It can't be bribed. It can't be boxed. This is the final truth they don't want to admit. Extroverts who've awakened are some of the most dangerous people on earth. Because once you stop seeking validation for your rhythm, you become unstoppable. Once you realize your desire for movement isn't immaturity, but a sacred intelligence, you become ungovernable. Once you accept that you don't owe the world stillness to be seen as whole, you become sovereign, no longer leaking your light for their comfort, no longer distorting your truth for their praise, no longer walking backwards through a maze. You are meant to burn to the ground. You are not here to be understood. You are here to be felt, to be experienced, to be witnessed, to be remembered as the one who refused to go numb. So let them keep their boxes. Let them stay inside their lines. Let them live for the applause of the silent and the dead. You'll keep moving, keep burning, keep breathing outside of what they can comprehend. Because now you know you were never flaky. You just needed more oxygen than the box could offer. And now that you've tasted the sky, you will never bow to a cage again. And now that you've tasted the sky, nothing else will satisfy. Not their comforts, not their compliance, not their careful, colorless containers built to tame your wild. You know too much now. You've danced too freely. You've spoken too boldly. You've become too alive to ever go numb again. They'll offer you cages dressed as commitments. They'll gift you roles carved from routine. They'll smile while they tighten the leash. But you'll just smile back, not out of defiance, but because you remember. You remember what you had to burn to get here. You remember what it cost to be whole. You remember every time you left, when it would have been easier to stay. Every boundary you drew when the world demanded collapse. Every time you stood in the fire and didn't flinch, not because it didn't hurt, but because you refused to leave yourself behind again. So now you walk like someone who's done explaining. You speak like someone who doesn't need to be believed to know the truth. You move like someone who belongs nowhere, because they belong everywhere their soul can breathe. You are not afraid of being misunderstood. You are afraid of disappearing inside something false. You are afraid of dimming down just to survive. You are afraid of dying with your truth still buried beneath politeness. So you stopped playing small. Stopped apologizing for the energy that moves mountains. Stopped editing your joy, your fire, your presence. You stopped shrinking because you finally understood the box wasn't protecting you. It was burying you. And now you are unburied. Now you are unboxed. Now you are unbroken. Not because you were never shattered, but because you made a cathedral from your cracks. So move when the soul says move. Disappear when the spirit says rest. Speak when the fire rises. Laugh when the world looks at you like a riddle they can't solve. Because that's exactly what you are. Not a problem to be fixed. A force to be felt. You are not flaky. You are freedom with a heartbeat. You are wildfire with direction. You are truth in motion. So go now. Go without guilt. Go without explanation. Go without permission. The sky is waiting. The wind remembers you. The path isn't paved because it was never meant to be. It was meant to be walked by the wild ones, by the ones who left the box behind and never looked back. And you are already halfway home because you finally remembered you were never the problem. You were the remedy. They couldn't package, the breath they couldn't bottle, the myth they couldn't manage. And now you rise, uncaged, uncontained, unapologetically you. Once upon a time, those 4 words were never meant to lull you to sleep. They were crafted to awaken something ancient, primal, and unspeakably real. A spell not of comfort, but of confrontation. A doorway not into fantasy, but into the dark corridors of the psyche itself. You've been lied to. They told you fairy tales were for children, but they were never meant for innocence. They were maps for the soul, written in metaphor, blood, and memory. You were fed the sanitized version, the princess in the tower, the brave knight, the happy ending. But what they cut out, what they buried, was the code, the dark code, the encrypted truth hidden in archetype, shadow, and symbol. They didn't want you to read the real story, because if you did, you'd stop playing the part they gave you. You see, every fairy tale is a mirror, but it doesn't reflect your face. It reflects your inner world, the war between your light and your darkness, the lost pieces, the repressed desires, the unhealed wounds. Carl Jung saw this clearly. He knew these stories weren't stories at all. They were mythic blueprints, psychic roadmaps, symbols designed to activate you. And what happens when you start to see the code? You stop romanticizing the damsel. You stop idolizing the knight. You realize the dragon was you all along. This is not a bedtime story. This is an awakening, because somewhere along the line she stopped waiting for the prince. She stopped brushing her hair by the window. She broke the mirror. She burned the tower. And in the ashes, she uncovered something that terrified the world. A woman with nothing left to lose and nothing left to pretend. The fairy tale wasn't about rescue. It was about initiation. They never told you that the forest was a metaphor for the subconscious, that the wolf was your primal instinct, that the witch was your intuition twisted into villainy because it couldn't be controlled. They never told you that happily ever after was the death of the transformation, because the real transformation, it happens in the dark. The girl who walks into the woods never returns as the same person. She sheds her skin. She faces the devourer. She dies symbolically so she can be reborn in truth. And what is truth? Truth is the moment she realizes no one is coming. Not the prince, not the fairy godmother, not the 7 dwarves. Only her naked, cracked open, trembling with rage and reverence. She understands now every fairy tale villain was a misunderstood archetype. The stepmother unprocessed resentment. The cursed hag disowned power. The sleeping spell generational trauma that kept her silent. But silence no longer protects her. She starts to remember. The code isn't outside, it's inside her. And once the symbols unlock, she doesn't just tell a new story. She becomes it. She becomes the wild woman, the hunter, the serpent, the queen. She becomes her own myth. Not a myth for children, a myth for the woman who buried herself to survive and is now clawing her way back with blood on her hands and a fire in her voice. This is syphoria, the ecstasy and terror of seeing yourself without the veil, the disintegration of false innocence, the collision between the psyche and the soul's rebellion. She doesn't run from the shadow anymore. She dances with it. She invites it in because she knows what Jung knew. The shadow, when recognized, is the doorway to power. And power doesn't come with crowns or weddings. It comes with the courage to feel everything you've repressed. She enters the castle, not to be wed, but to burn it, to burn the lies, to melt the golden cage. Because here's what no one told her. The happy ending is the lie. The real story begins after the credits roll. It begins when she looks around and realizes there's more. More than survival. More than roles. More than this hollow mimicry of a life. She was never meant to be ornamental. She was meant to be dangerous. And danger doesn't mean destruction. It means awakening. It means threatening the structure of anything that relies on her staying small. When she stops playing innocent, she becomes free. And freedom is not soft. It's ruthless. It's terrifying. It's raw. It's the look in her eyes when she decides she doesn't need to be liked, doesn't need to be saved, doesn't need to be understood. She needs to be sovereign. And that begins with mindset, not the shallow version of mindset sold in motivational books, not think positive or manifest your destiny, but owning the architecture of your perception, learning to see where the story has been implanted in you, where you were taught to betray yourself just to fit in. She rewrites that line by line, thought by thought. She reclaims her voice from the narrator that was never hers, the one that said, be nice, be pretty, be chosen. She deletes those lines with a single command, be whole. And wholeness requires darkness. It requires sitting with the wolves. It requires looking into the mirror and saying, I see you, I will not run. The mirror was never the enemy. It was the test. The mirror doesn't show flaws. It shows truth, unedited, unforgiving, unyielding. And if she can look at that, at her rage, her lust, her grief, her hunger, and not flinch, she wins not the fairy tale, but herself, her life, her legion. She no longer needs belief to be fed to her. She becomes the belief, she becomes the symbol, because belief is not repetition. Belief is action. Belief is sacrifice. Belief is blood on your hands and forgiveness in your bones. And clarity? Clarity is what comes after the storm, not before. Clarity is not handed to her by a wise old sage. It is forged in the fire of her own confusion. It is what remains after everything false is burned away. And what remains is vision, not fantasy, not escape, but the terrifying possibility of a life lived in full alignment. And that vision haunts her. Because once you've seen the truth, you can't go back to pretending. Once she saw who she could become, the old world felt like a prison. The dress didn't fit. The script sounded hollow. The print seemed small. She didn't need a savior. She needed space to become, to unravel, to evolve, to burn. So she set the match to the illusion and watched it turn to ash. Because sometimes evolution isn't gentle. It's not soft or quiet or poetic. Sometimes it's violent. Sometimes it's loud. Sometimes it's the scream that rips through her ribcage when she realizes she gave her life to a story that never saw her. And in that scream, she is born. She doesn't rise like a queen. She rises like a storm, not wearing a crown, but carrying a sword made of her own spine, because vision without action is delusion, and she is done dreaming with her eyes closed. She dreams now by building, by moving, by choosing. Every breath becomes a ritual, every decision a spell, every step sacred, not because she's seeking magic, but because she is it. The old self is gone, and she does not grieve it. That self was never hers to begin with. It was sewn together from expectation, fear, obedience, silence. This new self, it is jagged, it is raw, it is real, and it walks not with arrogance, but with purpose. Purpose not given, claimed. She doesn't find purpose in titles or trends. She finds it in the mirror, in the rage, in the tears that won't fall, in the sacred silence between heartbeats where she finally hears the voice beneath the noise. You were born for more. Not more success, not more fame, more truth, more depth, more presence, more you. That is purpose. To live so fully in your essence that your presence is a revolution. To live with such ruthless alignment that compromise feels like violence. And that purpose demands discipline. Not the discipline of punishment, not the cold rigidity of shame, but the fierce sacred discipline of devotion. Devotion to your higher self. Devotion to your craft, your path, your inner fire. Devotion to not betraying yourself again. She wakes before the world, not to grind, but to listen. She moves with intent. She speaks with weight. She holds herself like she matters because now she knows she does. And the world begins to notice, not her makeup, not her clothes, not her curated smile. It notices her gravity, her refusal to shrink, her unwillingness to play roles, her ability to sit in a room and command it without ever raising her voice. That power, it didn't come from books, or likes, or outside approval. It came from war, from walking through her own hell and choosing to come back whole. And still, she is grateful, not for the pain, but for what it revealed, for who it forced her to become, for the parts of her it shook loose and demanded she finally face. Because gratitude isn't softness. It's not blind positivity. It's not pretending things are fine when they're not. Real gratitude is reclamation. It's looking back at your wreckage and saying, I'm glad it broke because I was never meant to fit inside it. Gratitude is recognizing that every betrayal was a redirect. Every silence was a signal. Every fall was a forging. And now, forged in fire, she is adaptable, not bendable, unshakable, because she knows who she is beyond titles, beyond chaos, beyond identity. She's no longer afraid of losing because she's already lost everything false. What's left is unbreakable. She does not fear the unknown. She is the unknown. She is what happens when a woman remembers who she is beneath the programming. And that kind of resilience, it isn't taught. It's earned in silence, in solitude, in that sacred moment when you choose to rise. Not because you're ready, but because you're done waiting. And once you rise, you learn, not from textbooks, not from gurus, but from your own blood, your own sweat, your own sacred unraveling path. Because true knowledge isn't memorized. It's embodied. It's how she moves now, with history in her bones and mystery in her eyes, with the weight of every woman who came before her, and the light of every woman who will come after. She is no longer a character in a story she didn't write. She is the author, and she's writing in ink made of thunder. No more fairy tales, no more cages, no more silence. She has the code. She is the code, and the world will never be the same. Because when one woman rewrites her myth, she doesn't just free herself, she cracks the code for every soul bound by the same illusion. She becomes the rupture, the forbidden page, the glitch in a system that fed on her silence for generations. She doesn't scream to be heard anymore. She speaks in frequencies the old world can't decode. Every word she utters is a key. Every move she makes, a portal. Every truth she lives, a revolution. And they'll try to label her. They'll say she's too much, too intense, too emotional, too masculine, too wild, too free. But too much is what the system fears most. Because too much is the return of wholeness. And wholeness is impossible to control. She doesn't need to burn down the world. She just needs to stop lying. She just needs to live so fully in her truth that everything false around her shatters. She walks through boardrooms, churches, relationships, and ancestral wounds, not to conform, but to consecrate. She's not here to win in the old game. She's here to end it. and birth something that cannot be measured in profits or praise, something ancient, something holy, something real. This is the return of the dark feminine, not darkness as evil, darkness as depth, as mystery, as power that was once buried beneath centuries of obedience. She no longer seeks the light like a prisoner. She carries it inside her gut, behind her eyes, in the fire that never went out, even when the world said she should. She is a paradox, the nurturer and the destroyer, the oracle and the outlaw, the priestess in combat boots, the mother who births herself. And now that she has returned to herself, she will not leave again. She doesn't shrink for safety. She doesn't dim for comfort. She doesn't settle for silence. She builds temples in the wreckage. She turns every wound into a weapon of awakening. She carries the dark code in her body, not as a burden, but as a blueprint, because she knows now every fairy tale was a cipher, a test, a training ground, a map back to her deepest self. And she followed it, through betrayal, through exile, through the aching silence of forgetting. And now she remembers, not who the world told her to be, but who she was before the world got to her, before the shame, before the grooming, before she learned that to be good, she had to be small. She is no longer interested in being good. She's here to be goddamn true. And truth, in its rawest form, is terrifying, not because it's wrong, but because it can't be tamed. She is no longer a seeker. She is a seer. She no longer waits for the signal. She is the signal. Her life is no longer a reaction. It is a declaration. Every breath, a boundary. Every step, a decision. Every heartbeat, a war drum. She's not just living a new story. She's living beyond story, outside genre, outside the binary, outside the narrative trap. She is a myth reborn in flesh, not to entertain, not to perform, but to remind every woman still stuck in the tower, still gagged by politeness, still cutting herself down to be loved, that the door was never locked. It was just guarded by fear. And fear is what she eats for breakfast now, because the code was never broken. It was buried. And she dug it out with her own hands. Now she wears it like armor. She wields it like thunder. And she speaks it, not in words, but in presence. So when she walks into the room, something shifts, not because she demands it, but because the lie can't survive next to her truth. She has nothing to prove. She just island. And in a world built on pretense, being real is the most dangerous thing of all. She no longer plays by the rules, because she finally understands the rules were written to keep her asleep, to keep her tame, to keep her grateful for her cage. But now she builds her own game, her own rhythm, her own throne, not a throne perched above others, but one rooted in the soil of her authenticity, a throne built from the bones of everything she was told to kill inside herself. She sits on it, not to dominate, but to illuminate, because real power doesn't flex. It emanates. And that's what she's become, an emanation, a signal that says, I have returned from the underworld. I've danced with my demons. I've kissed my shadow. And I am no longer afraid of the dark, because I am it. She has stopped waiting to be chosen. She chooses herself, daily, ruthlessly, devotionally. She has stopped searching for belonging in places she had to betray herself to fit, because belonging without wholeness is just self-abandonment dressed in approval. Now she walks into every space as if she belongs there, because she belongs to herself, and that changes everything. You cannot manipulate a woman who knows her worth. You cannot seduce her with breadcrumbs when she bakes her own bread. You cannot tame her with shame when she's already forgiven herself. And when others try to box her in, with labels, with judgment, with fear, She just smiles because she knows they're not seeing her. They're seeing the ghost of the system they still serve. She's not here to convince anyone. She's here to remind the few who feel the same sacred fire. You are not crazy. You are not broken. You are not too much. You are awakening. And yes, it will cost you. It will cost you comfort. It will cost you approval. It will cost you the love that only existed when you played small. But what you gain is everything, because this isn't about rebellion for the sake of it. This is resurrection. This is the girl who died to become the woman who burned to become the force who speaks not just for herself, but for every silent story buried in the bones of her bloodline. She carries their voices now, their prayers, their rage, their unfinished sentences. And she doesn't carry them like a burden. She carries them like a torch. Because the dark code wasn't just meant to awaken her. It was meant to awaken you. This is not a fairy tale. This is the raw gospel of your return. You who have felt out of place your whole life. You who have known in your bones that something is wrong, not just out there, but in here. You who have watched yourself become a stranger, just to be loved. You're not broken. You're coded. And that code, it's not made of logic. It's made of myth. It speaks in archetypes and symbols. It activates through poetry, pain, and presence. And now you've heard it. Now you feel it. The pulse behind your ribs, the tremor in your gut, the part of you that rises when your mind says, sit still. Don't silence it again. Don't dress it up. Don't filter it to be palatable. Let it roar, because your return doesn't need to be graceful. It needs to be true. Let the world adjust to your rhythm, or fall away. Let the old stories choke on their irrelevance. Let the tower crumble, because the only thing that matters now is that you remember who you are. And when you do, you'll stop searching for the path, because you are the path. You always were. You always were the path. The forest wasn't a trap, it was an invitation. The curse wasn't punishment, it was prophecy. The fall wasn't failure, it was initiation. Every betrayal, every silence, every time you bit your tongue and smiled when you wanted to scream, it was carving a deeper well for your truth to fill. And now it's overflowing. Now you don't just speak your truth. You bleed it with every glance, every breath, every step that refuses to follow the lines drawn for you by people who never knew your name, only your obedience. You're not here to decorate the world. You are here to disrupt it. To seduce it into remembering the feminine isn't weakness. It's wildness. Not soft for their comfort, but soft like velvet over steel. Soft like storm clouds just before they split the sky open. You are what happens when softness refuses to collapse into silence. When the divine stops asking for permission. When the dark goddess in your bloodline finally opens her eyes and says, I will not be erased. You were never meant to be digestible. You were meant to be a reckoning. And now, you're no longer waiting for the world to call your name. You are the name. You are the myth reborn, not retold. Remade, you walk with ghosts behind you, yes, but they are no longer your chains. They are your chorus, and every step you take forward rewrites their fate, too. Because when a woman finally says no more, it echoes backwards. It sets the whole lineage on fire. She doesn't just heal herself. She rewires the entire timeline. She becomes the ancestor future generations will weep for in gratitude. Not because she was perfect, but because she remembered. She remembered her body was not a battleground. She remembered her voice was not a luxury. She remembered her hunger was not shameful. She remembered her magic was never lost, only suppressed. And now, she doesn't suppress. She summons the storm when it's needed. She summons the silence when it's sacred. She summons the fire to burn down anything built on falsehood. And when people ask her what she's doing, why she's not the same, why she doesn't bend like she used to, she doesn't explain. Because this isn't about explanation. It's about embodiment. They'll either feel it or they won't. Either way, she doesn't shrink because she's no longer in the story. She is the story. And it doesn't end with a wedding. It begins with a war cry. This is not a return to innocence. This is a return to intensity, to depth, to power with teeth and tenderness, to beauty that doesn't beg. She's not trying to be a queen anymore. She's trying to be free. Free from roles, free from rules, free from the lie that said her rage wasn't sacred, that her boundaries were too much, that her ambition was dangerous, that her love had to be small. She is done trying to earn worth that was always hers, done contorting herself for tables that collapse the second she stands up. Now she builds altars, not tables. And if you come to her space, you bring your truth, or you don't come at all. Because now she lives in devotion to one thing, her uncompromised self. That's the real code, the forbidden knowledge, the truth they tried to bury beneath ballads and bedtime stories. That you are the myth, that you were never broken, that you were always meant to be too much, too wild, too wise, too whole for a world built on fragments. And now that you see it, you can't go back. You're not supposed to. You're supposed to rise. You're supposed to rise. Not quietly, not politely, not in a way that makes others comfortable, but in a way that shakes the roots of everything built on your silence. You rise like prophecy, like the answer to a question the world was too afraid to ask. You rise not as the product of permission, but as the consequence of remembering. Because now you know, now you feel. And once you feel what it's like to be fully in your body, fully in your power, fully in your truth, you'll never tolerate the lie again. Not in your home, not in your love, not in your work, not in your reflection. You are no longer the girl hoping to be rescued. You are the force that breaks the spell. The tower didn't fall because someone saved you. It fell because you outgrew it. And now you walk not away from the fire, but as the fire itself. You are not too much. You are just enough to turn the world sacred again. So let them stare. Let them whisper. Let them question. Your life is no longer an explanation. It is an invocation. You speak, and something ancient wakes. You move, and old systems tremble. You breathe, and the next generation breathes deeper too, because you didn't just find your voice. You became it. The voice of every girl who was told to stay small. The voice of every woman who swallowed her truth to survive. The voice of the dark code that lived in every fairy tale, waiting to be unlocked. And now you're here, not as a character, as the creator, the living myth, the untamed song, the holy rewrite. And this time, there is no happily ever after. There is only ever becoming. So let them keep their endings. You are the beginning, the awakening, the roar that ends the silence, the fire that feeds the soul. You are the story they were afraid you'd become. Now go live it.